been driving for hours when the GPS signal finally died. The rental car bounced along the deteriorating gravel road as towering pines closed in from both sides. Late October had stripped most of the deciduous trees bare, leaving skeletal branches clawing at the overcast sky. The lake appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, a vast expanse of dark water that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Pinewood Lodge sat at the end of a narrow peninsula, a sprawling structure of timber and stone that looked like it had grown organically from the landscape decades ago. The job posting had been almost too good to be true. Winter caretaker for a private lakeside lodge. Room and board provided, generous pay, minimal responsibilities. Just maintain the property during the off-season when the owners were away. After 6 months of unemployment and a mounting pile of debt, he had applied immediately. The phone interview had been brief, almost perfunctory. The property manager, a woman named Eleanor Marsh, had asked few questions about his qualifications, and many about his comfort with isolation and his ability to follow instructions precisely. He pulled up to the main lodge as the afternoon light began its early winter fade. The building was larger than he had expected. 3 stories of dark wood siding with a wraparound porch and shuttered windows. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a newer addition jutted from the back, presumably housing more modern amenities. The whole structure exuded a sense of aged permanence, as though it had been watching over this isolated stretch of lakeshore since time immemorial. Eleanor Marsh was waiting on the porch, a tall woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore practical clothes, jeans, and a fleece jacket, but carried herself with an air of formality that made him straighten his posture as he approached. She shook his hand with a grip that was firm to the point of discomfort. They went inside, where the temperature was only marginally warmer than outside. The main room was cavernous, with exposed beam ceilings and a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Furniture sat shrouded beneath dust covers like sleeping ghosts. The air smelled of wood smoke, old books, and something else he could not quite identify. Something faintly organic and unpleasant. Eleanor led him through the lodge, pointing out the kitchen, the utility room, the storage areas. There were 12 guest rooms spread across the 2nd and 3rd floors, all closed up for winter. His quarters would be on the 1st floor, a modest apartment that had once housed domestic staff. It consisted of a bedroom, a small sitting room, and a bathroom with ancient but functional fixtures. The apartment had its own entrance from the side porch, which Eleanor noted he should use rather than walking through the main lodge unnecessarily. Then she brought out the rules. They were typed on yellowed paper, the text slightly faded as though the document had been copied and recopied many times. Eleanor placed the pages on the small table in his sitting room and regarded him with an expression that was difficult to read. She told him that previous caretakers who had followed these rules exactly had completed their terms without incident. Previous caretakers who had not followed the rules had left abruptly, usually in the middle of the night, and the lodge owners had been forced to find replacements on short notice. One caretaker had simply vanished, leaving his belongings behind. His truck had been found at the turnoff to the main road, abandoned with the keys still in the ignition. He asked what had happened to that caretaker. Alina said nobody knew. She said the local sheriff had investigated, but found nothing to suggest foul play. The man had simply walked away from his vehicle and disappeared into the woods. She said this in a matter-of-fact tone that suggested such occurrences, while regrettable, were not entirely unexpected. He picked up the rules and began to read. Alina watched him closely. The first rule stated that he must perform a complete walk around the exterior of the lodge every evening at dusk. He was to check that all shutters on the upper floors were latched and that no windows had come unshuttered during the day. If he found any shutters open, he was to close and latch them immediately, then return inside and lock the door behind him. He was not to investigate why they had come open. He was not to look too closely at the windows themselves. The second rule stated that he was forbidden from entering the lake water for any reason. He was not to wade in the shallows, not to step onto the dock that extended from the back of the property, not even to touch the water with his hands. If something fell into the lake, it was to be considered lost. He was not to attempt retrieval. The third rule stated that he must keep a fire burning in the main room fireplace from dusk until dawn every night without exception. The wood was to be taken only from the covered woodpile on the north side of the lodge. He was never to let the fire go out completely. If the fire died, he was to relight it immediately and then leave an offering on the hearth. The document did not specify what kind of offering. The fourth rule stated that if he heard knocking on any door or window after dark, he was not to respond. He was not to look outside. He was not to call out to ask who was there. He was to continue whatever he was doing as though he had heard nothing. The knocking would eventually stop. The fifth rule stated that between the hours of midnight and 3 in the morning, he was to remain in his quarters with the door locked. If he heard sounds from elsewhere in the lodge during these hours, footsteps or voices or doors opening and closing, he was to ignore them. He was not to investigate. Whatever was making those sounds would be gone by morning. The sixth rule stated that he was never to open the door at the end of the 3rd floor hallway. That room was to remain locked at all times. He was not to attempt to look through the keyhole. He was not to press his ear to the door to listen. The previous owners had left something stored in that room, and it was not his concern. The 7th rule stated that if he saw lights moving through the trees on the far side of the lake at night, he was to close the curtains and look away. These lights were not from other properties. There were no other properties on this lake. The lights would move in patterns that might seem purposeful, that might seem to be searching for something, but he was not to watch them or try to discern their source. The 8th rule stated that he should inventory the contents of the storage freezer in the utility room each week. There should be 4 large packages wrapped in brown butcher paper. They should remain frozen solid. If he ever found that there were fewer than 4 packages, or more than 4 packages, he was to leave the lodge immediately, get in his car, and drive away. He was not to return. He was to call a leaner from the main road and explain what he had found. The 9th rule stated that he might occasionally find small gifts left on the front porch in the morning. These would typically be natural objects, stones or feathers, or interesting pieces of driftwood. He was to bring these inside and place them on the mantel above the fireplace. He was to treat them with respect. He was never to throw them away or remove them from the lodge. The 10th rule stated that he was permitted to have visitors, but they must leave before dusk. Under no circumstances was anyone to spend the night at the lodge except him. If someone arrived unexpectedly after dark, he was not to let them inside, regardless of who they were or what reasons they gave. He was to speak to them only through the closed door and tell them to leave. If they refused, he was to go to his quarters and lock himself in until morning. A leaner finished watching him read and asked if he had any questions. He had many questions, but something about her expression and the tone she had used when describing the previous caretakers made him swallow most of them. Instead, he asked about the practical matters. The internet connection, which a leaner said was satellite-based and unreliable. The emergency contact numbers, which she provided on a separate card. The protocol if he needed to leave temporarily, which a leaner said was permitted as long as he returned before dusk and maintained the fire schedule. She told him she would be checking in by phone every few days. She told him the owners were elderly and very particular. She told him this was an easy job if he simply followed the rules and did not overthink things. Then she handed him the keys, wished him luck, and left. He watched her SUV disappear down the long driveway as the sun sank lower behind the trees. That first evening, he did exactly as instructed. At dusk, he walked the perimeter of the lodge. The building was larger than it had seemed from the front, with additions and wings extending in ways that created strange angles and recessed corners. Most of the upper floor shutters were already latched, but he found 2 that had swung open on the north side of the building. The windows behind them were dark and empty. He closed the shutters, secured the latches, and felt an unreasonable sense of relief when they were fastened tight. He built up the fire in the main room using wood from the designated pile. The logs were well seasoned, split to uniform size, and they caught easily. The growing flames pushed back the darkness and made the vast room feel slightly less oppressive. He dragged one of the shrouded armchairs closer to the fireplace and sat watching the flames while the lodge settled around him with creaks and groans. At 8:15, there was a knock on the front door, 3 deliberate raps that echoed through the empty lodge. He froze, the rules scrolling through his mind. Rule 4. He was not to respond. He remained perfectly still in the chair, forcing himself to stare at the fire, and only the fire. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Then a third time, loud enough that the door seemed to rattle in its frame. Then silence. He waited 10 minutes before he dared to move, half expecting the knocking to resume the moment he stood. Nothing happened. The fire crackled. The lodge creaked. Outside, the wind had picked up, causing tree branches to scrape against the siding. He added more wood to the fire and retreated to his quarters at 11:30, locking the door behind him and checking it twice. The sounds started at midnight exactly. Footsteps on the floor above, slow and measured, pacing back and forth. The creak of a door opening somewhere in the main lodge. What might have been voices, too muffled to make out words, rising and falling in conversation. He lay in bed with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, reminding himself of Rule 5. Between midnight and 3, he was to remain in his quarters. He was to ignore sounds from elsewhere in the lodge. The footsteps grew louder, as though whoever was making them had descended to the first floor. They seemed to pace up and down the hallway outside his door. At one point, his doorknob rattled as though someone were testing it. He pulled the blankets up to his chin and told himself it was just the old building settling, just the wind, just his imagination amplifying ordinary sounds. The rational part of his brain did not believe this for a second. At 3:05, the sounds stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The lodge fell into a silence so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat. He lay awake until dawn, then finally fell into an exhausted sleep as gray light crept around the curtains. He woke late, disoriented and gritty-eyed. Everything looked different in daylight. The lodge was just a building, old and creaky, but not sinister. He made coffee in the kitchen and conducted a walk through of the main floor. Nothing was disturbed. No doors stood open that should be closed. No evidence that anyone or anything had been wandering the halls during the night. He spent the day on routine maintenance tasks, checking pipes, testing the backup generator, clearing pine needles from gutters. The work was soothing in its normalcy. He was just a caretaker doing caretaker things at a remote property. The rules were eccentric, sure, but wealthy people often had eccentric demands. That did not make any of it supernatural. In the afternoon, he walked down to look at the lake, staying well back from the water's edge as instructed. The surface was like black glass, perfectly still. The far shore was thickly forested, and he could see no signs of human habitation. No houses, no docks, no cleared areas, just an unbroken wall of pines marching down to the water. The lodge truly was isolated. The nearest town was 40 minutes away over rough roads. The nearest neighbor, if there was one, was nowhere to be seen. As dusk approached, he performed his perimeter check. This time, 3 shutters had come unlatched, all on the east side of the building. He refastened them, noting that the latches showed no signs of damage or malfunction. They were simple hook and eye mechanisms, and they seemed sturdy enough. Yet somehow they kept coming open. That night followed the same pattern. Fire maintained, knocking ignored, sounds from midnight to 3 that made his skin crawl despite his determination to remain rational. In the morning, he found the first gift on the front porch. A smooth black stone, river-worn, sitting precisely in the center of the welcome mat. He brought it inside and placed it on the mantel as instructed. The days began to blur together. Each morning, he would wake exhausted from a largely sleepless night. Each day, he would perform maintenance tasks and try not to think about the approaching evening. Each dusk, he would check the shutters, always finding some unlatched. Each night, he would maintain the fire, ignore the knocking, lock himself in his quarters, and endure the sounds of invisible footsteps and voices. The gifts appeared most mornings: stones, feathers, pieces of twisted driftwood, the bleached skull of some small animal. He dutifully placed each one on the mantel, which was becoming crowded with offerings. He tried not to think about who or what was leaving them. Alina called on the 4th day. She asked how he was settling in. He almost told her about the knocking, the footsteps, the shutters that would not stay latched. But something stopped him, the memory of her expression when she had mentioned the previous caretakers. The matter-of-fact way she had described the one who had vanished. He said everything was fine. She said she was pleased. She reminded him to check the freezer inventory. He had been avoiding the utility room. It was in the basement, accessed through a narrow stairway off the kitchen. The basement was unfinished, just concrete walls and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The freezer was an old chest model, the kind with a heavy lid. He opened it and found the 4 packages, exactly as described, wrapped in brown butcher paper and labeled with dates from several months ago. They were solid as rocks. He closed the lid quickly, unsettled by something about the packages that he could not articulate. On the 7th night, he made his first mistake. He had been maintaining the fire carefully, adding logs at regular intervals, but he became absorbed in a book, one of the many volumes he had found on the lodge shelves, and when he looked up again, the fire had burned down to embers. Not quite out, but dangerously low. He rushed to add wood, building the fire back up until flames were crackling once more. Then he remembered the rest of the rule. If the fire died, he was to leave an offering on the hearth. He stood staring at the reviving fire, unsure what to do. The fire had not fully died, only diminished. Did that count? Was he supposed to leave something or not? He decided to err on the side of caution. But what kind of offering? The rules had not specified. He went to the kitchen and returned with a piece of bread and a cup of water, feeling foolish even as he placed them on the hearthstones. It seemed absurd, like something from a fairy tale. He went to bed that night feeling as though he had done something wrong, though he could not say what. The sounds that night were different. The footsteps were faster, more agitated. The voices were louder, though still incomprehensible. Something scraped against his door, a sound like fingernails dragging across wood. He lay rigid in bed, reciting the rules in his mind like a mantra. Remain in quarters. Ignore the sounds. Do not investigate. They will be gone by morning. In the morning, the bread and water were gone from the hearth. In their place sat a small arrangement of bones, delicate and white, configured in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. He stared at them for a long time before forcing himself to add them to the collection on the mantel. The days grew shorter as November progressed. Dusk came earlier, which meant the nightly ordeal began earlier. He fell into a rhythm born of necessity. Sleep when he could during the day, often in fitful stretches. Maintain his vigilance at night. Follow the rules exactly. Do not deviate. Do not question. He began to notice things about the lodge that had not registered initially. Scratches on the outside of the shutters, as though something with claws had been trying to get in. Wet footprints on the porch some mornings, even when there had been no rain. They were not boot prints. They were too large, too strangely shaped. He mopped them away and did not let himself think about them. The lights appeared on the 12th night. He was in the main room, feeding the fire, when movement through the window caught his eye. Across the lake, visible through the trees, multiple lights were moving. They bobbed and weaved, sometimes disappearing behind the forest, sometimes visible as bright spots in the darkness. They moved in a coordinated fashion, sweeping back and forth as though searching. He remembered Rule 7 and immediately closed the curtains. But curiosity gnawed at him. What were those lights? Who would be out there in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night? The rational explanation was that there was some property on the far shore after all, and someone was out looking for something. A lost dog, maybe, or a child. He should probably go out and see if they needed help. He was halfway to the door before he caught himself. This was exactly the kind of thinking that got people in trouble. The rules had said to ignore the lights. They had said there were no other properties on this lake. He forced himself to sit back down and not look outside, even though the urge to peek through the curtains was nearly overwhelming. The lights continued for over an hour. He could see their glow through the curtain fabric, sweeping across the windows. At one point, the quality of the light changed, and he had the distinct impression that whatever was carrying the lights had crossed the lake and was now much closer, possibly on the shore near the lodge. He heard nothing, no sounds of boats or footsteps, just saw the lights moving past the windows. Then they were gone, fading back into the forest. Alina called the next day. Something in his voice must have betrayed his stress, because she asked pointed questions about whether he was following the rules. All of them. Exactly. He assured her he was. She told him the first month was always the hardest. She told him it would get easier as he adjusted. She did not say adjusted to what. He asked her about the lights. She was silent for a long moment, and he could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Then she said she did not know what the lights were. She said no one knew. She said every caretaker reported seeing them eventually. She said the important thing was that he had not gone outside to investigate, and he had not watched them. He confirmed he had done neither. She said good. She said that was very good. After that conversation, he began to feel as though he were being tested. Not by Alina, but by something else, by the lodge itself, or by whatever presence inhabited this place. The knocking became more insistent. The nighttime sounds more active. The shutters not only came unlatched, but sometimes he found them hanging completely open, banging against the siding in the wind. Despite his careful securing, the gifts on the porch became stranger. A dead bird arranged in a circle of pine needles. A rusted knife with a bone handle. A photograph in an old frame showing the lodge in summer with people on the porch, their faces too blurred to make out. He placed everything on the mantel, which was becoming a bizarre altar of natural and unnatural objects. On the 18th night, he experienced true fear for the first time since arriving. He was in his quarters after midnight when he heard footsteps approaching his door. But these were different from the usual nighttime sounds. These were wet, making a squelching noise with each step, as though whoever was making them had just emerged from water. They stopped outside his door. The doorknob began to turn, slowly testing against the lock. He watched in horror as it rotated back and forth, back and forth. Then came a sound that made his breath catch. Scratching. Something was scratching at the wood around the doorframe, trying to dig through. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then it stopped. The wet footsteps retreated. In the morning, he forced himself to examine his door. There were gouges in the wood, deep and fresh. Whatever had made them had been real and physical, not his imagination, not the product of an overstressed mind. Something had actually tried to claw its way into his room. He almost quit that day. He stood by his car with his bag packed, keys in hand, trying to decide. The money was good, and he needed it desperately. He had nowhere else to go, no other job prospects. And part of him, perhaps the most stubborn part, refused to be driven away. He had followed the rules. Whatever was happening here, he had done nothing wrong. He had not gone in the water. He had not opened the locked room. He had ignored what he was supposed to ignore. He unpacked his bag and stayed. The pattern continued. Perimeter checks revealing unlatched shutters. The the nightly fire maintained without fail, gifts collected and displayed, the hours between midnight and 3 spent locked in his quarters while the lodge came alive around him. He stopped trying to sleep during those hours and instead sat in the old chair by his window, curtains drawn, reading by lamplight, and pretending he could not hear the sounds from the rest of the building. He began to understand why the previous caretaker had abandoned his truck and walked into the woods. There was a pressure to this place, a weight that accumulated over days and weeks. It wore on the mind. It made isolation feel like imprisonment. The rules that had seemed merely eccentric now felt like a fragile barrier between him and something that wanted very badly to reach him. On the 23rd day, a leaner called with different news. The owners wanted to visit. They would arrive the following afternoon and stay for 3 days. She told him to prepare the master suite on the 2nd floor, to stock the kitchen with the groceries being delivered in the morning, to make sure everything was clean and welcoming. She said the owners were old friends of hers and very important people. She said he was to be courteous and accommodating, but not intrusive. He was to continue following the rules exactly, and he was to make sure the owners did the same. He spent the next day in a frenzy of preparation, removing dust covers, airing out rooms, cleaning bathrooms that had not been used in months. The delivery truck arrived with boxes of expensive groceries and several bottles of wine. He stocked everything away and tried to make the lodge look lived in rather than like the museum piece it had become. The owners arrived precisely at 2 in the afternoon. They were indeed elderly, both probably in their 80s. The man introduced himself as Dr. Richard Aldridge. His wife was Helen. They moved slowly, but with purpose, carrying themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to ownership and authority. They inspected the lodge with approving nods, complimented him on the upkeep, and then largely ignored him as they settled into their visit. That evening, he watched Dr. Aldridge build up the fire with the ease of long practice. The old man clearly knew about the rules, knew about the importance of the fire. Over dinner, which they had invited him to join, Dr. Aldridge spoke about the lodge's history. It had been in his family for 4 generations. His great-grandfather had built it as a private retreat, a place to escape from the pressures of society. Even then, the location had been chosen for its remoteness. He wanted to ask about the rules, about the things that happened after dark, but something in Dr. Aldridge's manner discouraged questions. The old man spoke of the lodge fondly, but with an undertone of something else. Respect, maybe, or fear disguised as respect. That night, the knocking came as usual. He heard it from his quarters and wondered if the Aldridges heard it too in the master suite. Apparently they did, because they did not respond either. At midnight, the footsteps and voices began. He lay in his bed, listening to the familiar sounds, and now he could hear other sounds as well, coming from the 2nd floor. the Aldridges moving around, their own footsteps distinguishable from the others. They were awake. They were enduring the same nocturnal disturbances. They knew. In the morning, Helen Aldridge appeared tired but composed. Dr. Aldridge looked as though he had not slept at all, but he went about his day with determination. They spent the daylight hours reading, taking short walks on the property, well away from the lake. Speaking in low tones to each other, he kept his distance as instructed, but remained available if they needed anything. On their second evening, Dr. Aldridge asked to speak with him privately. They sat in the main room near the fire while Helen retired early. The old man looked at him with eyes that were sharp despite his age. He said he wanted to thank him for following the rules. He said many caretakers had struggled with that. He said the lodge demanded a certain kind of person, someone who could accept mysteries without demanding explanations, someone who could live with uncertainty and ambiguity, someone who understood that not everything could or should be rationalized. He asked Dr. Aldridge what was really happening at the lodge. What was behind the rules? The old man was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful. He said the land around the lodge was old, older than the forest, older than the lake in its current form. He said his great-grandfather had known this when he built here. He said there were things that inhabited this place long before humans arrived, and they never truly left. The rules were not arbitrary. They were accommodations, agreements of a sort. As long as the rules were followed, the lodge and its occupants would be left relatively unmolested. If the rules were broken, the agreement was void. He asked what would happen if the rules were broken. Dr. Aldridge did not answer directly. Instead, he told a story about a caretaker from the 1950s. A man who had thought the rules were superstitious nonsense, who had deliberately gone swimming in the lake on a dare from friends he had invited to stay over. He had gone into the water shortly before sunset. He had never come back out. His friends claimed they saw him go under and not resurface. The lake was dragged, but his body was never found. The friends left that night and never spoke of what else they had seen. But apparently, it was significant enough that both of them ended up in psychiatric care within a year. He asked about the locked room on the 3rd floor. Dr. Aldridge smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. He said that room predated his family's ownership. When his great-grandfather had purchased the land and the hunting cabin that had stood here previously, that room had already been there, and it had already been locked. The previous owner had made the lock a condition of the sale. The Aldridges had honored that condition for over a century. No one in the family had ever opened that door. No one knew what was inside. Dr. Aldridge said he suspected that not knowing was the point. The Aldridges left on the 3rd day, thanking him again for his service and assuring him that a leaner would be in touch about extending his contract if he was interested. After they departed, the lodge felt emptier than before. Having other people present, even for just a few days, had reminded him of normalcy. Now he was alone again with the rules and the presence that enforced them. Winter deepened. The first snow came, dusting the pines and turning the world silent and white. The lake froze along the shoreline, but remained open water in the center, dark and restless. His routine had become automatic. Check shutters, maintain fire, collect gifts, lock door at midnight, endure, wait for dawn. He began having dreams, vivid and disturbing. He dreamed of walking into the lake, of the water closing over his head, of sinking down through frigid darkness to a bottom that did not exist. He dreamed of the locked room opening, of something emerging that had been waiting decades to be released. He dreamed of the lights across the lake resolving into figures, tall and wrong in their proportions, carrying lanterns that burned with foxfire as they crossed the frozen surface toward the lodge. He would wake from these dreams gasping, heart racing, and have to remind himself they were not real. But the line between the dreams and waking reality was becoming blurred. Sometimes he was not entirely sure he had actually woken up. On the 42nd night, he made his second mistake. During his evening perimeter check, he found that one of the third floor shutters had not just come unlatched, but had broken off completely. Hanging by a single hinge, the window behind it was exposed to the elements, and snow was blowing inside. He stood in the gathering dark, staring up at the window, trying to decide what to do. The rule said to close and latch any open shutters. It said nothing about what to do if a shutter was damaged beyond simple closing. The practical part of his mind said he needed to go up there and either rehang the shutter or board up the window to prevent water damage. But the third floor was where the locked room was located. He had avoided the third floor entirely since arriving. Even during his initial tour with Alina, she had only shown him the third floor hallway from the bottom of the stairs. He decided he had no choice. Preventing property damage was part of his job. He would go up, deal with the window, and come right back down. He would not go near the locked room. He would follow the rules as much as possible while addressing the immediate problem. The stairs to the third floor were narrow and steep. They creaked under his weight in a way that seemed too loud in the silent lodge. The third floor hallway was dim, lit only by the failing daylight through the one unshuttered window. There were 4 doors along the hallway, 3 on one side and 1 at the far end. That would be the locked room. He kept his eyes averted from it. The damaged shutter was on a window above the stairwell, requiring him to lean out somewhat precariously to assess the situation. The hinge was rusted through, irreparable without proper tools. He would need to board it up from inside. He went back downstairs to get plywood and a hammer. When he returned to the third floor, it was fully dark outside. He had violated his own timing, staying out past dusk. The realization sent a spike of anxiety through him, but he was committed now. He fitted the plywood over the window and was hammering it in place when he heard the sound. It came from behind him, from down the hallway, the sound of a door creaking open slowly. He froze, hammer upraised. He had not gone near the locked room. He had followed the rule. But even without turning around, he knew which door had opened. The rule said he was never to open that door. It said nothing about what to do if the door opened on its own. He forced himself to finish hammering the last nail. Then he turned very slowly. The door at the end of the hallway stood ajar, darkness visible in the gap. Nothing emerged. No sound came from within. Just the open door and the darkness behind it. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get off this floor immediately. But another part of him, the curious part that had gotten humans in trouble since the dawn of time, wanted to look, wanted to know what was in that room after over a century of being locked away. He took one step toward the door, then another. He was halfway down the hallway when he heard the wet footsteps behind him, the same ones that had approached his door weeks ago. He spun around and saw it at the top of the stairs. It had the general shape of a human, but wrong in ways his mind struggled to process. Too tall, joints bending in directions they should not, skin that glistened wetly in the dim light. Where its face should have been was a smooth expanse, broken only by two holes that might have been eyes. Water dripped from it, pooling on the floor, even though the lake was 100 yards away. They stared at each other for a moment that stretched impossibly long. Then it moved toward him with frightening speed, those wet footsteps slapping against the floor. He ran, not toward the stairs, which it blocked, but down the hallway toward the only other option, toward the open door. He plunged through into the locked room and slammed the door behind him. His hands found a bolt on the inside, and he threw it just as something heavy crashed against the other side. The door shuddered but held. Scratching sounds began, the same ones he had heard on his quarters door, but the door was solid wood, old-growth timber, and it did not give. He stood in the darkness of the locked room, breathing hard, and slowly became aware that he was not alone. There was something else in here with him, multiple somethings. He could hear breathing, slow and measured, coming from several directions. His eyes adjusted gradually to the darkness, and he began to make out shapes. They sat around the walls of the room. 5 of them, maybe 6, hard to count. They had the same too tall, wrong-jointed appearance as the thing in the hallway, but these were older, more withered. They sat motionless, as though they had been sitting there for a very long time. Decades. Longer. One of them spoke. The voice was like wind through dead leaves, barely comprehensible. It said that he should not be here. It said this room was sacred ground, a place of keeping, a place of binding. It said the one in the hallway was the newest, the one who had been in the lake when the great-grandfather built the lodge. It said the others had been here longer, much longer, bound by agreements older than memory. It said he had broken the rule by being here, but also that he had been driven here, which was a different matter. He asked what they wanted. The thing that had spoken tilted its head, considering. It said they wanted nothing. They simply were. They existed in this place between things, neither fully present nor fully absent. The rules kept the boundaries clear. The rules maintained the agreement. He asked about the caretaker who had vanished, the one who left his truck. The thing said that man had opened the locked room deliberately. He had not been driven here by necessity. He had come with intentions of breaking the bindings, of releasing what was kept here. They had shown him what would happen if they were released. He had walked into the woods afterward and never stopped walking. He asked if he could leave. The thing said the door could not be opened, while the one from the lake still raged outside. But it would tire eventually. They always did. He should wait. So he waited, sitting on the floor with his back to the door, while the ancient things sat in their places around the walls, and the wet thing from the lake scratched and hammered outside. Hours passed. The scratching eventually subsided. The presence outside retreated. One of the things around the walls, different from the first that had spoken, made a sound like rustling paper. It said he had been adequate. He had followed the rules closely enough. The broken shutter was not his fault, and his response to the door opening had been understandable. He would be permitted to continue, but he should remember that the rules existed for good reasons. The rules maintained the balance. When dawn light finally crept under the door, he tried the bolt. It slid back easily. He opened the door a crack, ready to slam it shut again if needed. The hallway was empty. No sign of the wet thing, no evidence anything had happened, except for puddles of water on the floor and deep scratches on the outside of the door. He walked downstairs on shaking legs. The fire in the main room had gone out, but he did not have the energy to restart it yet. He simply sat in his chair and watched the sun rise through the windows. Alina called at 8. She asked if everything was all right. Something in her voice suggested she already knew something had happened. He told her about the shutter, about the door opening, about what he had found inside. She was silent for a long time. She said he was very lucky. She said most people who saw the things in that room did not handle it well. She asked if he wanted to leave. He surprised himself by saying no. She said she was impressed. She said the Aldridges would be impressed as well. She said very few caretakers made it through an entire winter season. Those who did were usually offered permanent positions if they wanted them. He asked her what the things in the room really were. She said nobody knew for certain. The theories ranged from ancient spirits displaced by human expansion to something that had always existed in the spaces between human understanding. What mattered was the arrangement. As long as the rules were followed, as long as the boundaries were maintained, coexistence was possible. After the call, he rebuilt the fire and went about his day. He was exhausted, but also felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He had faced the worst the lodge could present, and he had survived. He understood now what Dr. Aldridge had meant about the place demanding a certain kind of person. It demanded someone who could stare into the inexplicable and not break. The remaining weeks of winter passed more easily. Not that the nightly disturbances stopped, but they felt routine now, expected. He knew the boundaries. He knew what was required of him. The gifts on the porch continued, and he displayed them dutifully. The lights across the lake appeared regularly, and he ignored them as instructed. The shutters continued to come unlatched, and he secured them every evening. He fell into a strange peace with it all. He was the caretaker. This was his responsibility. The lodge and the things that inhabited it were his charges. He maintained the agreement through his adherence to the rules. It was, in an odd way, the most purposeful he had felt in years. On the 1st of March, Alina called to say the winter season was officially over. She asked if he was interested in staying on as the spring and summer caretaker. The rules would change with the season, she said. Different accommodations for different times. He said yes, without hesitation. She said she was glad. She said he had proven himself in ways most people never could. She said the lodge had accepted him, and that was rare. She said the Aldridges wanted to meet with him again, this time to discuss a permanent position. He could live at the lodge year-round if he wanted. They would pay well. All he had to do was continue following the rules. He looked around his small apartment at the life he had built in this strange, liminal place. He thought about the alternative, returning to the regular world with its mundane problems and ordinary fears. That world seemed hollow now, insubstantial. Here at the lodge, at least, he knew where he stood. Here the fears were real, but bounded by rules. Here his purpose was clear. He told Alina he would stay. That evening, he performed his perimeter check, as always. The first warm breeze of spring was blowing across the lake, carrying the smell of thawing earth. The ice along the shore was breaking up, revealing black water underneath. He checked each shutter methodically, securing the few that had come loose. When he came around to the front of the lodge, he found a new gift on the porch. It was different from the others. A small carving, clearly made by skilled hands, depicting the lodge in miniature. Every detail was perfect, down to the individual logs in the walls. It was beautiful and unsettling in equal measure. He picked it up carefully and brought it inside, placing it in the center of the mantel, among all the other gifts accumulated over the months. He built up the fire and settled into his chair to wait for dusk. Outside, the long shadows of the pines stretched across the snow. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, the first he had heard in weeks. Spring was coming. The seasons were changing, but the rules remained constant. The agreement held. As darkness fell, he heard the first knock of the evening on the front door. 3 measured raps, familiar as an old friend. He sat perfectly still and stared at the fire, a slight smile on his face. He was home. The weeks that followed brought a shift in the atmosphere of the lodge. Spring was asserting itself with increasing confidence, and with it came changes he had not anticipated. The snow began its slow retreat, revealing patches of brown earth and dead grass. The lake ice groaned and cracked at night, sheets of it breaking free and floating toward the center where the dark water waited. The sounds were different now, less muffled, more alive with the noises of thawing and awakening. Alina called in mid-March with the new rules. She said they were simpler than the winter protocols, but no less important. He was to write them down exactly as she dictated, and he did, filling 3 pages with her careful instructions. The fire was no longer required during daylight hours, but it must still burn from dusk until dawn. The perimeter checks remained mandatory. The locked room was to stay locked, always. But there were new additions, seasonal requirements that made his skin prickle as he wrote them. He was not to go near the lake between the hours of 4 and 6 in the morning. That was when they emerged to drink, Alina said. He did not ask who they were. The rule stated that if he saw figures standing at the tree line during these hours, he was to close all curtains immediately and remain inside until full sunrise. Under no circumstances was he to make eye contact with them. He was forbidden from gardening or disturbing the soil anywhere on the property. The earth around the lodge was not to be dug, not even to plant flowers or vegetables. If he found holes that had not been there before, shallow depressions in the ground near the building, he was to fill them immediately with stones from the lakeshore. Not dirt, only stones. Then he was to salt the ground around them. The gifts would continue, but their nature would change. In spring and summer, he might find arrangements of flowers, bones cleaned to whiteness, or items that seemed to have been taken from inside the lodge itself, things he thought he had put away, objects from rooms he knew were locked. He was to display these as before, but he was also to keep a journal documenting what appeared and when. Alina would review this journal during her monthly visits. He was permitted to have the windows open during the day, but all windows must be closed and locked before dusk, without exception. Something about the spring air drew things closer, Alina explained. The boundaries were more permeable during the turning of seasons. Vigilance was crucial during these transitional periods. If he heard singing at night, wordless melodies that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, he was to get into bed immediately, cover his ears, and wait for silence. The singing was rare, Alina assured him, but it did happen. Previous caretakers who had listened too long had reported severe disorientation and lost time. One had been found wandering the property at dawn with no memory of the night before, speaking in a language no one could identify. The week after receiving the spring rules, he experienced his first dawn encounter. He had risen early, unable to sleep, and was making coffee in the kitchen when he glanced out the window. It was 4:10, and the sky was just beginning to lighten. At the tree line, perhaps 50 yards from the lodge, stood a group of figures. There were 7 of them, maybe 8, difficult to count because they stood so still they almost blended with the trees. They were tall, impossibly tall, and even from this distance, he could see they were wrong. Their proportions were off, their limbs too long, their postures suggesting joints that bent in ways human joints should not. They faced the lodge, and though he could not make out features in the dim light, he had the overwhelming sense that they were watching him. He remembered the rule an instant before he would have met their gaze directly. He jerked his eyes away and stumbled to the windows, pulling the curtains shut with shaking hands. He moved through the first floor, closing every curtain, ensuring no gaps remained. Then he sat in his chair by the dead fireplace and waited, listening to his heart hammer in his chest. At 6:15, he dared to peek outside. The figures were gone. The tree line looked ordinary, innocent in the growing daylight, but he could see tracks in the mud, leading from the forest down to the lake shore. They were not human tracks. They were larger, deeper, with too many toe impressions. He counted 9 distinct trails before he forced himself to look away and go about his morning routine. That evening, he found the first spring gift. It was a bouquet, if it could be called that, arranged on the porch. Wildflowers he did not recognize, tied together with what looked like human hair. The flowers were beautiful in an alien way, petals that seemed to shift color in the light, stems that were too smooth, too perfect. He brought them inside with reluctance and placed them in a vase on the mantel. The hair binding them he tried not to think about. The journal Alina had requested became a chronicle of increasingly strange occurrences. He documented the gifts, the sightings at dawn, the sounds that seemed to circle the lodge on certain nights. He wrote about the morning. He found a perfect circle of mushrooms had grown overnight on the north side of the building. White toadstools arranged with geometric precision. He salted the circle as instructed and watched the mushrooms wither and blacken within hours. He wrote about the day he discovered one of the second-floor guest room doors standing open, even though he had not been upstairs in weeks, and all doors had been firmly closed. Inside, the dust covers had been removed from the furniture and neatly folded. The bed was made with hospital corners, the pillows fluffed. It looked as though the room had been prepared for an arriving guest. He pulled the covers back over everything, closed the door, and tried not to wonder who had been in there. April brought heavier rains, and with them came the holes. He found the first one on a gray morning, a shallow depression near the front steps, perfectly circular, about 2 feet in diameter. The earth around it was loose, recently disturbed. He collected stones from the lakeshore as instructed, filling the hole until it was level with the surrounding ground. Then he sprinkled salt liberally around the area. By evening, the salt had turned black. More holes appeared over the following days. One by the woodpile, two behind the generator shed, a cluster of three near the path to the lake. He filled them all with stones and salt, spending hours hauling rocks and performing the ritual. He did not know what would happen if he failed to fill them, and he did not want to find out. Elinor visited in late April. She arrived in the afternoon, inspected the lodge with her usual thoroughness, and sat with him to review his journal. She read every entry carefully, nodding occasionally, her expression revealing nothing. When she finished, she looked at him with something that might have been approval. She said he was doing well, better than well. The lodge was responding to him, she said, which was unusual. Most caretakers were tolerated at best, but the lodge and its inhabitants seemed to have accepted him as part of the place. The gifts were more elaborate than usual, the encounters more frequent, but not hostile. This was good, she assured him. It meant he had achieved a balance. He asked her what lived here. What were the things at the tree line, the presence in the locked room, the entities that left gifts and dug holes and rearranged furniture in closed rooms? Elinor was quiet for a long time, staring out at the lake. When she spoke, her voice was softer than usual. She said no one truly knew. Dr. Aldridge's great-grandfather had found evidence that suggested this place had been significant long before European settlement. The indigenous people who had once lived in this region had avoided this particular lake. Their oral histories spoke of it as a threshold place, a location where the boundaries between worlds grew thin, a place where older things dwelt, things that predated humanity. The great-grandfather, being a man of science and skepticism, had dismissed these stories as superstition. He had built the lodge as a retreat, a place to escape the modern world. But within the first year, the incidents began. Disappearances, strange sightings, sounds that could not be explained. He had tried to leave, to abandon the property, but found he could not. Something prevented him. Every time he tried to depart permanently, circumstances would conspire to bring him back. Eventually, he had consulted with the few remaining elders from the indigenous communities. They had told him the same thing. This place demanded a keeper, a human presence to maintain the boundary, to acknowledge the inhabitants, to follow the old protocols. Without a keeper, the things that lived here would grow restless. They would venture beyond the lake. They would look for human habitation elsewhere, and wherever they went, disaster followed. So the great-grandfather had established the rules, cobbled together from the elders' advice and his own terrible experiences. And he had stayed, becoming the first keeper. When he died, his son took over. Then his grandson. Now the Aldridges were old and could no longer manage the place themselves, so they hired caretakers. But the requirement remained. Someone had to be here. Someone had to maintain the agreement. Someone had to keep watch. Alina said the reason so many caretakers failed was simple. They could not accept what they were experiencing. They tried to rationalize it, to explain it away, to convince themselves nothing supernatural was happening. This cognitive dissonance broke them. But he had adapted. He had accepted the reality of the place without demanding explanations. This made him valuable. She asked if he understood the full weight of what he had taken on. He said he thought he did. She shook her head. She said he would understand in time. The lodge changed those who stayed long enough. It marked them. Even if he eventually left, he would carry this place with him. He would never be quite the same as other people. He would always have one foot in the ordinary world and one in the threshold place. After Alina left, he sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the lake. The water was clear of ice now, dark and restless under the wind. Somewhere out there, beneath the surface, were things he could not imagine. Around him, in the forest and the earth and the lodge itself, were presences he would never fully understand. And he was the keeper, the watcher, the human anchor point that maintained a fragile peace. May arrived with an explosion of green. The forest came alive with new growth, and the property required different kinds of maintenance. He cleared gutters of pine needles and winter debris. He checked the roof for damage. He tested the shutters, many of which needed repair after months of mysterious unlatching. He worked methodically, finding comfort in routine and physical labor. The nighttime disturbances had not stopped, but had changed character. The knocking was less frequent, but more varied, coming from different doors and windows. Each time, the sounds between midnight and 3 had taken on a different quality, less threatening, more curious. Sometimes, he heard what sounded like conversation, multiple voices speaking in low tones from the main room. He never investigated. He remained in his quarters as required, listening to the lodge conduct its mysterious business. The dawn figures appeared regularly now, perhaps 3 or 4 times a week. He had learned not to look directly at them, to catch only peripheral glimpses as he closed the curtains. They seemed to be observing, studying, their presence neither hostile nor friendly. They were simply there, as much a part of the landscape as the trees and the water. Late one night in mid-May, he heard the singing. It began just after midnight, a wordless melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, multiple voices, harmonizing in ways that should not have been possible, creating chords that made his head swim. The sound was beautiful and terrible, pulling at something deep inside him, making him want to stand up and walk outside, to find the source, to join in. He forced himself into bed, pulled the pillow over his head, pressed his palms against his ears. Still, the singing penetrated, vibrating in his bones, in his teeth. He lost track of time, floating in a space between waking and sleeping, where the music was everything. When silence finally came, he surfaced slowly, disoriented, and found that dawn light was streaming through the windows. He had lost 6 hours. The experience left him shaken, but also strangely exhilarated. He had survived it. He had followed the rules and endured something that might have broken someone else. He documented it carefully in his journal, trying to capture the quality of the singing, the sensation it had produced. His words felt inadequate, but he did his best. As spring progressed into early summer, he fell into a deeper rhythm with the place. He could sense moods now, subtle shifts in atmosphere that told him when to be extra vigilant, when to perform the rituals with particular care. Some days the lodge felt almost benign, the presence gentle, the gifts simple and beautiful. Other days carried an edge of tension, a feeling that he was being tested, that boundaries were being probed. On the good days, he explored the property more thoroughly than he had dared during winter. He walked the shoreline, always staying well back from the water. He discovered old trails in the forest, paths that led to nowhere, dead ending at trees or boulders that seemed deliberately placed as barriers. He found carved symbols on some of the older trees, marks that were clearly not natural, but whose meaning he could only guess at. He found the remnants of structures deeper in the woods, foundations of buildings that predated the lodge, stone arrangements that might have been walls or might have been something else entirely. In one clearing, he discovered a circle of standing stones, each about waist high, weathered smooth by centuries of exposure. The grass inside the circle was dead, the soil bare and dark. He did not enter the circle. He stood at its edge, feeling the weight of ages, and then retreated back to the lodge. On the bad days, he felt watched constantly. Even indoors, with all curtains drawn, he heard scratching in the walls, footsteps on the roof, splashing sounds from the direction of the lake when it was perfectly calm. Objects would move when he was not looking. He would place his coffee cup on the table, turn away for a moment, and find it across the room. Books would fall from shelves without cause. Doors would be open that he knew he had closed. The Aldridges visited again in June. They stayed for a week this time, and he observed how they interacted with the place. They performed small rituals he had not been taught, leaving offerings in specific locations, speaking words in a language he did not recognize. Dr. Aldridge spent hours sitting silently on the porch, staring at the lake, as though in meditation or communion with something unseen. One evening, Helen Aldridge spoke with him while her husband was elsewhere. She told him about her daughter, who had grown up spending summers at the lodge. The daughter had loved it as a child, had felt the magic of the place without fear, but as she grew older and understood more, she had become terrified. She refused to visit after age 16. She had moved across the country, as far from the lake as possible. She never spoke of the lodge to her own children. The trauma of understanding what the place truly was had marked her permanently. Helen said this with sadness, but also acceptance. She said not everyone was meant to be a keeper. It required a particular constitution, a specific kind of strength that was rare. Her daughter had not possessed it, and that was not a failing. It was simply how things were. Helen said she saw that strength in him, though. She said he would do well here if he chose to stay. But she also said he should understand what he was giving up. The longer he stayed, the harder it would be to leave. The lodge would claim him, subtly but completely. He asked if she had ever wanted to leave. Helen smiled, but it was a complicated expression. She said yes, many times, but she had also grown to understand her role. She and Richard were part of something larger than themselves. They were threads in a tapestry that stretched back centuries and would extend centuries into the future. The lodge would outlast them. The presences here would outlast humanity itself. Their task was simply to maintain the peace for their brief moment in time. After the Aldridges departed, he found a letter on his pillow. It was from Dr. Aldridge, written in careful script. The letter contained information not shared verbally, secrets the old man had deemed important to write down. It explained the history of the locked room in greater detail, the binding ritual that had been performed there by the indigenous elders at the great-grandfather's desperate request. It described what would happen if the binding failed, the catastrophic consequences that would follow. The letter concluded by thanking him for his service and assuring him that he had been chosen well. He kept the letter in the drawer of his bedside table, rereading it occasionally when he needed to remember why he was here, why the rules mattered, why his vigilance was crucial. Summer brought tourists to the region, and occasionally vehicles would venture down the long driveway, lost or curious. The rule about visitors became more frequently tested. He would meet them on the porch, polite but firm, and explain that the property was private. No tour were available. They needed to turn around. Most complied easily. A few were insistent, wanting to see the lake, wanting to camp nearby, wanting to explore. With these, he had to be more forceful. No one stayed past dusk. No one ever stayed past dusk. One group, 3 college students on a camping trip, arrived at 5:30 on a July evening. They were cheerful and entitled, dismissive of his explanations, insisting they just wanted to camp by the lakeshore for one night. They would leave in the morning. What was the harm? He told them no. They argued. They tried to drive past him toward the lake. He blocked the path with his own vehicle. The argument escalated. They threatened to call the sheriff to report him for harassment. He let them call. The sheriff, when he arrived 2 hours later, understood immediately. He spoke briefly with the students, then ordered them to leave. They protested, but something in the sheriff's tone made them comply. After they drove away, the sheriff stayed for a few minutes, speaking with him in low tones. The sheriff said he knew about the lodge. His grandfather had worked with the Aldridges years ago on several incidents. He said if there were ever real trouble, to call immediately. He said he would come, but he also said he hoped never to have to come at night. Then he left. The incident rattled him more than he wanted to admit. The students had no idea how close they had come to disaster. If they had managed to stay, if they had been present after dark, what would have happened? He imagined them encountering the figures at the tree line, hearing the knocking, experiencing the midnight hours without preparation or understanding. It would have ended badly. He had protected them by refusing them, even though they had not known they needed protection. The journal entries multiplied. He documented everything now, creating a record that was part maintenance log, part chronicle of the supernatural, part personal diary. He wrote about the morning. He found perfect spiral patterns traced in the dew on the windows. About the afternoon, a flock of birds fell silent all at once, hundreds of them, and did not resume singing for over an hour. About the night, he woke to find his room filled with soft blue light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere, pulsing gently like a heartbeat, then fading away. August brought heat, and with it came lethargy that affected even the place. The manifestations decreased. The gifts became less frequent. The dawn figures appeared only once or twice a week. It was as though everything was resting, conserving energy during the hottest months. He used this quieter period to perform deep maintenance projects he had been putting off. He repainted the trim on the exterior. He replaced rotted boards on the porch. He cleaned the gutters thoroughly and repaired the generator shed roof. Alina visited in late August and approved of his work. She brought news that the Aldridges wanted to offer him a permanent contract, year-round employment, with a significant salary increase and benefits. He would become the official keeper, recognized and compensated as such. There would be a formal agreement, legal documents that outlined his responsibilities and protections. He would have security, purpose, a place in the world that was uniquely his. He signed the contract without hesitation. September brought the first hints of autumn, and with the cooling temperatures came a return of activity. The lodge woke from its summer drowsiness. The nightly sounds increased. The gifts returned with regularity, often elaborate arrangements of autumn leaves, acorns, and small bones. The dawn figures reappeared every morning without fail, their numbers sometimes reaching 15 or 20, standing silent and watchful at the tree line. He had been at the lodge for nearly a year now. The anniversary of his arrival passed without fanfare. Just another day of routine and vigilance. But something had shifted. He realized one morning that he no longer felt like a temporary visitor, a caretaker just passing through. He felt like part of the place. He understood what Helen Aldridge had meant about being claimed. The lodge had claimed him. The lake had claimed him. He belonged to this threshold place now, and it belonged to him. October arrived with its dying light and falling leaves. He prepared for his second winter, knowing what to expect this time, ready for the long, dark months ahead. Aliner delivered the winter rules again, though they had not changed. He read them over anyway, reminding himself of each protocol, each requirement, each boundary that must not be crossed. On the anniversary of his first night at the lodge, October 28th, he performed his evening perimeter check as the sun set. The shutters were all secure. The fire was built and ready to light. The lodge stood solid and permanent against the gathering darkness. He had made it through a full year. He had survived and adapted and ultimately thrived in a place that broke most people. He felt a quiet pride in this accomplishment. As he completed the circuit and returned to the front of the lodge, he found a gift unlike any before. Sitting on the porch, carefully placed in the exact center of the welcome mat, was a small wooden box. It was beautifully crafted, decorated with carved symbols that matched those he had seen on the trees in the forest. He picked it up carefully and carried it inside. The box was not locked. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a key. It was old iron, with an ornate head and a long shaft. He recognized it immediately. It was the key to the locked room on the third floor. A note lay beneath it, written in handwriting he did not recognize, elegant and archaic. The note read simply, "You have earned trust, but trust is not permission. The boundary remains. The key is acknowledgement, not invitation." He stood holding the key for a long time, understanding its significance. This was recognition from whatever inhabited this place. He had proven himself worthy of knowledge, even if that knowledge was never to be acted upon. He placed the key in the wooden box and set it on the mantel among all the other gifts collected over the year. He would keep it safe. He would never use it, but he would treasure it as a symbol of acceptance, of belonging, of having found his place in the world. That night, the knocking came as expected. 3 measured raps. He sat in his chair by the fire and smiled. He was the keeper of Pinewood Lodge. He was the watcher at the threshold. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The fire crackled. The lodge creaked and settled. Outside, the lake whispered against the shore. And in the darkness, ancient things moved through their mysterious routines, content that the boundary was being maintained, the agreement honored, the old ways preserved by one human stubborn enough and strange enough to accept a world that defied all explanation. He tended the fire through the night, feeding it log by log, keeping the flames dancing bright against the darkness. And when dawn finally came, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, he looked out across the lake and felt something he had not felt in years before coming here. He felt at peace. He felt at home. Whatever the future held, whatever challenges the coming years might bring, he would face them here, in this threshold place, keeping watch over mysteries older than memory, serving as the fragile human link between worlds that should never touch, but somehow did. The lodge would change with the seasons. The rules would shift. New challenges would arise, but he would remain constant and vigilant, the keeper who had finally found what he had been searching for all along: a purpose, a place, a reason to wake each morning and tend to duties that mattered in ways most people would never comprehend. As the sun rose higher, burning away the last shadows, he turned from the window and began his morning routine. There was work to be done, always work to be done. The wood needed stacking for winter. The generator needed servicing. The perimeter needed walking. And somewhere out there, in the forest or the lake or the spaces between, the inhabitants of this place were settling into their daytime dormancy, trusting that he would continue to honor the agreement, to follow the rules, to maintain the boundary that kept chaos at bay. He was the keeper, and this was his life now, strange and terrifying and absolutely perfect. She said no one truly knew. The theories ranged from ancient spirits displaced by human expansion to something that had always existed in the spaces between human understanding. What mattered was the arrangement. As long as the rules were followed, as long as the boundaries were maintained, coexistence was possible. After Alina left, he rebuilt the fire and went about his day. He was exhausted, but also felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He had faced the worst the lodge could present, and he had survived. He understood now what Dr. Aldridge had meant about the place, demanding a certain kind of person. It demanded someone who could stare into the inexplicable and not break. The remaining weeks of winter passed more easily. Not that the nightly disturbances stopped, but they felt routine now, expected. He knew the boundaries. He knew what was required of him. The gifts on the porch continued, and he displayed them dutifully. The lights across the lake appeared regularly, and he ignored them as instructed. The shutters continued to come unlatched, and he secured them every evening. He fell into a strange peace with it all. He was the caretaker. This was his responsibility. The lodge and the things that inhabited it were his charges. He maintained the agreement through his adherence to the rules. It was, in an odd way, the most purposeful he had felt in years. On the 1st of March, Alina called to say the winter season was officially over. She asked if he was interested in staying on as the spring and summer caretaker. The rules would change with the season, she said. Different accommodations for different times. He said yes, without hesitation. She said she was glad. She said he had proven himself in ways most people never could. She said the lodge had accepted him, and that was rare. She said the Aldridges wanted to meet with him again, this time to discuss a permanent position. He could live at the lodge year-round if he wanted. They would pay well. All he had to do was continue following the rules. He looked around his small apartment at the life he had built in this strange, liminal place. He thought about the alternative, returning to the regular world with its mundane problems and ordinary fears. That world seemed hollow now, insubstantial. Here at the lodge, at least, he knew where he stood. Here the fears were real, but bounded by rules. Here his purpose was clear. he told Alina he would stay. That evening, he performed his perimeter check as always. The first warm breeze of spring was blowing across the lake, carrying the smell of thawing earth. The ice along the shore was breaking up, revealing black water underneath. He checked each shutter methodically, securing the few that had come loose. When he came around to the front of the lodge, he found a new gift on the porch. It was different from the others. A small carving, clearly made by skilled hands, depicting the lodge in miniature. Every detail was perfect, down to the individual logs in the walls. It was beautiful and unsettling in equal measure. He picked it up carefully and brought it inside, placing it in the center of the mantle, among all the other gifts accumulated over the months. He built up the fire and settled into his chair to wait for dusk. Outside, the long shadows of the pines stretched across the snow. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, the first he had heard in weeks. Spring was coming. The seasons were changing, but the rules remained constant. The agreement held. As darkness fell, he heard the first knock of the evening on the front door. 3 measured raps, familiar as an old friend. He sat perfectly still and stared at the fire, a slight smile on his face. He was home. The transition into spring brought revelations he had not expected. As the snow melted completely and the forest came alive with new growth, he discovered things about the property that winter had hidden. There were more stone circles in the woods, 5 in total, arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement. Each one had the same dead center, the same weathered stones. He mapped their locations in his journal, noting how they formed points of what might be a larger geometric shape. He found carved symbols on boulders, half buried in the earth, markings that matched those on the trees, but were far older, worn nearly smooth by time. He photographed them all, creating a record that Alina reviewed with intense interest during her next visit. She told him no previous caretaker had been this thorough, this observant. The Aldridges would be pleased. The spring rules proved more challenging than the winter protocols in some ways. The dawn encounters became a daily test of discipline. Every morning between 4 and 6, the figures would gather at the tree line, sometimes as many as 20 of them, standing silent and watchful. He learned to set alarms to ensure he closed the curtains before their arrival. The one morning, he slept through his alarm and woke to find them standing there, their eyeless faces turned toward his window, haunted him for weeks. The holes in the earth multiplied as the ground thawed. Some mornings, he would find a dozen new ones, requiring hours of work to fill them all with stones and salt. He developed a system, keeping buckets of lake stones ready, bags of salt stored in the utility room. The ritual became meditative, a way to interact with whatever forces created the holes without direct confrontation. The singing came 3 more times that spring. Each time he followed the protocol, getting into bed and covering his ears. Each time he lost hours, emerging disoriented but unharmed when silence returned. He learned to prepare for these episodes, leaving notes for himself, explaining what was happening, setting out water and food for when he came back to himself. The notes helped anchor him, reminded him that he had survived this before and would survive it again. June brought the Aldridges back for their extended visit. This time, they stayed 2 weeks, and he observed how they had their own rituals, their own ways of interacting with the place. Dr. Aldridge would walk the property at specific times, pausing at the stone circles, speaking words in that language he did not understand. Helen would leave her own offerings, different from his, placed at locations he had not known were significant. One evening, Helen took him aside and showed him a photograph album. It contained pictures of the lodge going back over a century. In the oldest photos, he could see the original structure, smaller than it was now, surrounded by forest that looked darker, more primal. There were photos of the various caretakers over the years, faces both proud and haunted. Some photos showed groups at the tree line, though the figures were always blurred, as though they resisted being captured on film. Helen showed him a photo from the 1920s. A man stood on the porch, and in the background, barely visible, something moved through the trees. The figure was tall and wrong, just as he had seen countless times. Helen said this was the first photographic evidence the family had obtained. They had been trying to document the phenomena for decades, but the entities seemed to avoid cameras, to somehow sense when they were being recorded. She told him the family had theories, generations of accumulated observations and speculation. They believed the lake was a thin place, a location where the barrier between worlds was naturally weak. The entities that lived here existed partially in this world and partially in another, slipping between when conditions allowed. The rules were not invented, but discovered, tested through trial and terrible error over many years. Each rule represented someone's sacrifice, someone's hard-learned lesson. The rule about the lake water, for instance, came from the great-grandfather's own experience. He had touched the water in the first week of his residence, just dipped his fingers in out of curiosity. For 3 days afterward, he had been violently ill, plagued by visions of drowning, of sinking through endless dark water to a place where things with too many limbs waited hungrily. He had nearly died before the fever broke. The rule about the locked room came from an incident in the 1890s. A caretaker hired by the second generation, Aldridge had forced the door open despite instructions. According to the family records, he had emerged screaming 3 hours later, his hair turned completely white, unable to speak coherently for weeks. When he finally regained his faculties, he refused to discuss what he had seen, only repeating that the room must remain locked, must always remain locked. He had left the property immediately and never returned. Helen said each rule had a story, each boundary a reason written in suffering. The current caretaker benefited from over a century of accumulated knowledge, purchased at great cost by those who came before. He should honor that legacy by following the rules precisely and adding his own observations to the family's records. After the Aldridges departed, he felt the weight of that history more keenly. He was not just a caretaker. He was a link in a long chain, a keeper of knowledge that stretched back generations. His journal was not just a personal record, but a contribution to something larger, a growing understanding of this threshold place and how to coexist with its inhabitants. Summer deepened, and he fell into rhythms that felt almost normal. The manifestations decreased in the heat, becoming more subtle. The gifts became simpler, often just a single perfect flower or an interesting stone. The dawn figures appeared less frequently, sometimes going days without showing themselves. It was as though everything rested during the hottest months, conserving energy for the more active seasons. He used this quieter time to explore his own relationship with the place. He began to notice patterns in when things happened, correlations between natural phenomena and supernatural activity. The entities were more active during storms, during new moons, during the transition hours of dawn and dusk. They seemed to draw energy from liminal times and liminal spaces, thriving in moments of change and uncertainty. He also noticed how his own state of mind affected things. When he was calm and centered, following the rules with mindful attention, the manifestations were less intrusive, more respectful of boundaries. When he was anxious or distracted, forgetting small details or rushing through rituals, the activity increased, became more aggressive. It was as though the entities could sense his mental state, responding to his respect or lack thereof. This realization led him to develop his own practices, supplementing the required rules with personal rituals. He began each day with meditation, centering himself before the dawn hours when the figures might appear. He approached each task, from filling holes to checking shutters, with mindful attention, treating them as sacred acts rather than mere chores. He spoke aloud sometimes when alone, greeting the morning, thanking the lodge, acknowledging the presence of things he could not see. He did not know if these personal practices made a difference, but they helped him maintain the mental discipline required for this life. They gave him a sense of agency, a feeling that he was not just following rules imposed from outside, but actively participating in the maintenance of balance. August brought a leaner for her monthly visit, and she noticed the change in him immediately. She said he seemed more settled, more integrated with the place. She asked if he was happy, and he realized with some surprise that he was, not in a conventional sense, but in a deeper way. He had found meaning and purpose. He had found a place where he belonged, however strange that place might be. Alina told him the Aldridges were preparing the permanent contract. It would include a significant salary increase, health benefits, a pension plan. They were treating this as a serious, long-term position, recognizing the value of someone who could thrive here rather than merely survive. She said they had discussed leaving the property to him in their will, ensuring continuity of care after they were gone. The idea stunned him. To own this place, to become its steward not just for years, but for the remainder of his life, perhaps to pass it on to someone he chose and trained. It was a responsibility beyond anything he had imagined, but it also felt right. He told Alina he was honored and would consider it seriously. September arrived with cooling temperatures and the first hints of autumn color. The activity level increased again, the entities emerging from their summer dormancy. The gifts became more frequent and more complex. The dawn figures returned in full force, sometimes numbering 30 or more. The nighttime sounds grew louder, more varied, as though the lodge itself was waking up after a long sleep. He prepared for his second winter with a mix of confidence and humility. He knew what to expect now, but he also knew the place could still surprise him, still test him in new ways. He stocked supplies, checked and double-checked equipment, reviewed the winter rules until he could recite them from memory. On the anniversary of his arrival, October 28th, he performed his evening perimeter check as the sun set. The shutters were all secure. The fire was built and ready to light. The lodge stood solid and permanent against the gathering darkness. He had made it through a full year. He had survived and adapted and ultimately thrived in a place that broke most people. As he completed the circuit and returned to the front of the lodge, he found a gift unlike any before. Sitting on the porch, carefully placed in the exact center of the welcome mat, was a small wooden box. It was beautifully crafted, decorated with carved symbols that matched those he had seen on the trees in the forest. He picked it up carefully and carried it inside. The box was not locked. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a key. It was old iron, with an ornate head and a long shaft. He recognized it immediately. It was the key to the locked room on the 3rd floor. A note lay beneath it, written in handwriting he did not recognize, elegant and archaic. The note read, "You have earned trust, but trust is not permission. The boundary remains. The key is acknowledgement, not invitation." He stood holding the key for a long time, understanding its significance. This was recognition from whatever inhabited this place. He had proven himself worthy of knowledge, even if that knowledge was never to be acted upon. He placed the key in the wooden box and set it on the mantel among all the other gifts collected over the year. He would keep it safe. He would never use it, but he would treasure it as a symbol of acceptance, of belonging, of having found his place in the world. That night, the knocking came as expected. 3 measured raps. He sat in his chair by the fire and smiled. He was the keeper of Pinewood Lodge. He was the watcher at the threshold. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The fire crackled. The lodge creaked and settled. Outside, the lake whispered against the shore. And in the darkness, ancient things moved through their mysterious routines, content that the boundary was being maintained, the agreement honored, the old ways preserved by one human stubborn enough and strange enough to accept a world that defied all explanation. He tended the fire through the night, feeding it log by log, keeping the flames dancing bright against the darkness. And when dawn finally came, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, he looked out across the lake and felt something he had not felt in years before coming here. He felt at peace. He felt at home. Whatever the future held, whatever challenges the coming years might bring, he would face them here, in this threshold place, keeping watch over mysteries older than memory, serving as the fragile human link between worlds that should never touch, but somehow did. The lodge would change with the seasons. The rules would shift. New challenges would arise, but he would remain constant and vigilant, the keeper who had finally found what he had been searching for all along: a purpose, a place, a reason to wake each morning and tend to duties that mattered in ways most people would never comprehend. As the sun rose higher, burning away the last shadows, he turned from the window and began his morning routine. There was work to be done, always work to be done. The wood needed stacking for winter. The generator needed servicing. The perimeter needed walking. And somewhere out there, in the forest or the lake or the spaces between, the inhabitants of this place were settling into their daytime dormancy, trusting that he would continue to honor the agreement, to follow the rules, to maintain the boundary that kept chaos at bay. He was the keeper, and this was his life now, strange and terrifying and absolutely perfect. He stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cold morning air, watching mist rise from the lake like spirits ascending. The trees stood silent and watchful. The stones in their ancient circles held their secrets, and he stood between worlds, the human anchor, the keeper of rules, the watcher at the threshold. And he smiled, because finally, after a lifetime of searching, he had found where he belonged.